What role should patriotism play, if any, in your auto purchase decisions? Right now, we have a world of rising tariffs, a changing Chinese auto market, and, well, in the West, governments and the media and consumers who seemingly are trying to self-destruct. And it's been this way for decades. So should your patriotism play a role? I've got a lot to say about this today. Welcome back to All Cars, y'all. I am John. This is going to be a long and winding road of a rant opinion. I'll go ahead and tell you this. Me and my family largely try to purchase American when we can. If it's a similar price and similar quality, I'd rather buy from an American company. But governments and media and the companies themselves have screwed this up over the decades. At its most basic, is it more patriotic to buy a Ford built in Mexico or a Honda built somewhere in the South? Well, that's up for interpretation, and as a matter of fact, we have one of each out in our driveway right now. But there's a lot more to it around this, and one of the things that's most frustrating to me is that when we in the West, if we were to do things that they do in other countries, there would be absolute outrage from politicians to the media to journalists to buyers. It would just be endless. But they're doing it somewhere else, and it's apparently not fair for us to do the same thing. I'll touch on what I'm talking about there a little bit later. But for now, let's start with back in the day, in the 60s and 50s, you just generally bought American. People had their preferences. You were a Chevy family, a Ford family, a Dodge family, whatever it happened to be. And of course, there were imports around. You had Jaguars and Mercedes or MGs or, the random Fiat, things like that. But basically, you bought American. And then the 70s came. And I will hold to the fact I believe the 70s are the most influential decade in automotive history, not for advancing the art or styling, but for its impact and its change on society and cars. At the beginning of that decade, everybody was still had their big American V8 heavy rear-wheel drive cars. And by the end, the Japanese were ascendant with these many front-wheel drive, unibody, lightweight, nimble little cars. And in between, you had the OPEC crisis, you had gas lines, and piling on top of it all was our own government. On the one hand, you had the EPA getting the authority and writing the regulations to set emissions standards to theoretically decrease smog, and it did. And then you also had increasing safety standards and fuel economy standards. But the problem with those regulations and how they were written was if they wrote them to punish the American auto manufacturers, it couldn't have been done better or differently. They wrote the regulations and rewarded the Japanese manufacturers and many imports for what they were bringing here already while punishing our own industry. And of course, then the media and journalists pick it up and blame the industry for building the cars that people bought in mass, but saying, look how archaic they were, they're behind the times. Well, it's not all the industry's fault, but they were certainly part and parcel of it. They were building not terribly good cars at the time, many of them, not all of them, but it was a dramatic decade where the regulations were punishing our own industry. Now, by the beginning of the 80s, things were starting to change, and certainly had like the Omni, the K-Car, and the Ford Escort were coming out, things like that. But it takes years and years to totally revitalize your lineup, downsize it, unibody, change the engines and transmissions and everything else, and meet these new standards. And the Japanese were way ahead of the curve on all this, and our industry, rightfully or wrongfully, got kicked around. Now, one guy comes out, and his name was Lee Iacocca, and in some portions of their ads, they actually were like, playing the America card, playing Buy American, in some cases saying things like, look, give us a try. Try us against the imports, and if you like a better car, if you like a different car, buy it.
If you can find a better car, buy it.
but at least give us a shot. So when I was younger and in the 80s, there was a sense of patriotism, and we had a movement to buy American. We had little American flags on our clothing, and then there was certainly the cars and everything else. And it's all just kind of, over the past 35, 40 years, it's just kind of faded away. And I think a large part of that is with NAFTA and with globalization. You've got the American auto manufacturers, but they build a few cars in China and they build some in Mexico. And, well, what's really American anymore? Well, this all comes up because right now we are in the midst of a transition, let's say, part of which is the EV transition. And there's been a lot of talk for many years. I've done a few videos on it about the Chinese EVs coming here to America. They are expanding around the world. We already have tariffs on Chinese imports, cars, and European Union just passed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, trying to protect their industry. And of course, there's an outrage in the media about this. You have countries in Europe disagreeing with each other. Germany is very concerned, France not so much, or vice versa. It's endless arguments about what to do. But over here, you have the Chinese supporting their auto industry, helping them work together, building up the infrastructure beneath it. But we can't do anything to protect ourselves without an absolute outrage. And so the point I'm making here is we have undermined our auto industry for well over 40, about 50 years now. And doing anything to protect it brings out outrage that we can't do that. That's wrong. American consumers have changed to buy the best vehicle at the best price for their needs. And a lot of the, well, it's American, has really gone away. There's still some out there. Absolutely, there's some out there and you run into it. But generally speaking, there's a lot of people, and I hear from them in my comments, I don't care if it's Chinese, as long as it's cheaper. And that kind of attitude has built basically Walmart. You don't care how crappy it is as long as it's cheaper. And along the way, you find some manufacturers that become gooder, like Honda and Toyota and Mitsubishi and everybody else. They didn't make terribly good vehicles back in the 50s and the 60s, but by the 80s, the 90s, they'd figured it out and were building some of the best in the world. And that's what people expect, I think, from China. They're only going to get better. And it's easy to want to dismiss China as being over there, but they are right now, I believe, they are the first biggest auto market in the world. The fact is, they don't need us anymore. And that's kind of the crux of the issue here for me, that we're putting up tariffs and our own media and politicians are arguing against it. Well, that just means more jobs leaving America and Western Europe. On the other hand, when the Western companies moved into China, China very smartly said, that's fine, but you have to partner with a Chinese company. And Volkswagen and General Motors and everybody else was like, absolutely, because they wanted access to the Chinese market. So let's stop there for a second and say, okay, China, you're good. You want to come to America? Well, BYD, you can't come here by yourself. SAIC, you can't come here by yourself. You need to set up a company where you're 49% ownership, but you have to partner with with Ford, with Stellantis, or with General Motors, or with Tesla, or with Rivian, or something like that. You can't come here by yourself. The outrage in the media and from politicians would be off the charts. But that's what the Chinese did to us. And now, after decades of using Western knowledge, learning our manufacturing, learning our quality control, building up an entire infrastructure from resources to the final finished product, now the market in China is shifting. People are buying less of those Buicks and Volkswagens. It's a very important market for Mercedes, brands with that kind of panache, I guess. But the Chinese are very patriotic. And so if there's an equivalent manufacturer over here that's Chinese, or at least close to equivalent, they're going to buy the Chinese one. And that is what is eroding Western auto manufacturers' market share in China. It's Chinese patriotism. Now, I want you to imagine a world where we have a movement in America and people are like, you know what, let's buy Ford or Chevy because they're still based here in America. They're still American companies. They still use UAW members. Imagine the outrage on social media and the journalists and the media, the news, the politicians of how unfair that is. It's just outrageous to me. And so the point of this is that I think patriotism plays a part, too many P's there, of your purchasing decisions. Now, where you draw the line between it's an American company, but it's built in, say, Mexico, Canada, or Korea, or China, like Ford or GM, or if it's a Japanese company that's building it in the deep south somewhere. Which one's more American, the worker or the company? That's perhaps an argument for another day. But I think we can all agree the Japanese are not our global geopolitical enemies. And there should be a movement in the West, not only in America, but in Western Europe, to say, wait a minute, this is our homegrown industry where people are being employed right here, and we should support them. Now, what I leave out of all this is Stellantis, which is unfortunately kind of the worst of everything. They're not from America. They're not American. They're not headquartered in America. They're firing engineering staff and moving it somewhere else in the world for cheaper engineering. So my point here, and the reason I'm ranting, is because we insist on undermining ourselves, and people and consumers actively do it. And the politicians don't help, the regulations don't help, the companies don't even help themselves along the way. And you can look over here at China and see what they did with the industry coming in, or with the buying habits of the people, with their patriotism for their homegrown industries. And you just don't see it over here. We are self-destructing. And I think there needs to be a little bit more move to support our industry. Let me know what you think below on this one, guys. I appreciate you being here.